I think we should go to our speaker tonight, who's Larry Rosenblum, who is going to be talking to us about Philately and Postcards, a perfect pair. And we have a lot of, as I said, a lot of people that are involved in both, so it ought to be a very interesting talk. So with that, I'll turn it over to our friend Larry, and we'll take it from there.
And okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you all for allowing me to present this evening. My talk is titled, as Shab said, Postcards and Philately, the Perfect Pair. Now, I am a stamp collector, or to use the technical term, a philatelist. And yet I haven't counted them, but well over 100 postcards in my collection. Let me explain why. Stamp collecting is, to many of us, a very flexible hobby. Everyone defines what they collect and how they collect. Some collectors are literally stamp collectors. They collect pretty much only stamps. They put them in an album or a shoebox or whatever it is. But others have a much more expansive view of it, including myself. So they want to have not only stamps, but understand how they're printed, why they're issued, how they were used, examples of things that are kind of peripheral to stamps, and so on and so forth, and examples of how they were used. And that's, of course, one way that postcards fit in. Many countries have and still do, as the United States does, issue stamps that are at the rate for sending postcards. And if you want an example of how it's used in general, that would be on a postcard. Postcards may also have markings of interest, or be sent to a person of interest or a destination of interest, things like that, all of which would be interesting to a philatelist. So I'll show you some examples of several of those things. And I'll begin with a few slides showing how postcards are integral to philately. And then I'll show you a lot of examples, most of which are from France, as you can see on my title slide here, because that's what I'm primarily collecting these days, and that's what I picked out to show. So stamp shows, which happen from local ones like Philatelic Fiesta, that's coming up, as Shab mentioned, to international shows that happen a few times a year in various countries. Stamp shows, the larger ones anyway, have exhibits where collectors put together pages that show their collection and tell a story. And in many cases, there are categories. And in many cases, one category is picture postcards, as you can see here. This was a picture I took at the IBRA International Stamp Show in Germany this past May. And this is just one frame that I picked at random. A frame in general in stamp collecting contains 16 pages. And you can see here that this is 16 pages, primarily filled with postcards, telling the story of the American Great White Fleet voyage of 1907 to 1909. And these postcards, we don't know if they were mailed or they were just purchased and saved. In this case, there's no interest in, whether they have a stamp on them, whether they went through the mails. They're using postcards to tell the story. And there were quite a few exhibits in that category at this show. Many stamp collecting publications also have articles about postcards. On the left is a monthly publication in the United Kingdom called Stamp Collector, and that's an article about postcards. On the right is an article from another UK publication, the Philatelic Exporter. Unfortunately, that publication was discontinued a couple of years ago, but at least in recent years, they had every issue a regular feature called Postcard World. And in the center is a French magazine called Timbre, which is the French word for postage stamp. And it has in every monthly issue an article about postcards. This one is about the 14th of July, which is their Independence Day. That was the first day of the French Revolution in 1789. And often postcards are used in presentations and that are given by stamp collectors. So here's an example. On the left is a postcard that was part of a presentation being given to the France and Colonies Philatelic Society earlier this year. And the presenter was showing this postcard, which was related to the theme of his talk. And it was addressed to a woman at the Chateau des Pendants. And then he used this picture postcard that you see on the right to tell those of us who are attending more about the castle and show a picture of the castle. So here's a place where the postcard was used to elaborate on a philatelic theme. This is a postcard where the picture relates to philately. This is a postcard showing the outdoor bourse in Paris. This is a practice that started in Paris in the 1860s and still continues today, although consistent with the smaller size of the hobby, it's only a shadow of its former self. This card dates from 1941. And as most of you know, that was during the German occupation of France. But the bourse and the stamp collecting hobby continued. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that collectors may have just wanted to continue the hobby as a way to escape from their situation, or maybe they didn't particularly care about the occupation. And the Germans encouraged things like this because they wanted the French people to think, oh, nothing unusual now, just go on with your life. Don't think about the fact that we are now here running your country. So this is a card from a stamp show in 1941. It was printed from a wood engraving by Émile Boiseau and based on a design by Paul-Émile Lecomte. And we can see from the back, the cancellation is repeated on the back. You can't see it very well on the front. It's from a stamp exposition in Paris called Art in the Stamp. And the exhibition was from the 15th to the 30th of November, 1941. So that was a 16-day stamp show, which kind of boggles our minds today. The biggest stamp shows are 8 days and sometimes fewer, and smaller stamp shows now are 2 or 3 days. But back then, philately was a much more popular hobby, and stamp shows were longer. This is another card that dates from the German occupation, having to do with philately. It is a card that was sold to raise money for prisoners. And the design is a postman sitting in a carriage, which is being pulled through the air by these giant swans. And sitting on the edge of his windshield is another postman. And that postman has wings coming out of his back. I can't explain this picture at all. I don't know if there's anything to it, much more than a fantasy, but it's certainly a striking image. On the back, you can see that it was also from a stamp exhibition in April 1942 in the town of Valenciennes. Now, this is one of my favorite cards because of its subject. What's pictured on the card is the balloon mail from Paris in 1870. So to make a long and fascinating story short, the Franco-Prussian War started in the summer of 1870. The French were completely outclassed, And the Prussians essentially just came west and took over parts of France that they were interested in. They bypassed Paris and settled in Versailles, in the Palace of Versailles, which is southwest of Paris. And then they proceeded to put a siege around Paris, just cut the town off. Rather than trying to take the town or the city by force, they just decided to enforce a siege and wait it out. So the Parisians were cut off from food and things like that, and they were also cut off from communication. And what they did to get around that was start sending letters out of Paris carried by manned balloons. And that started at the end of September in 1870. And one point about balloon flight is there's no way to steer a balloon. The pilot, one of the people in the balloon, is designated as the pilot, and he has the ability to raise or lower the balloon to some extent, raising it by throwing ballast overboard, or even sometimes throwing mail overboard, and lowering it by letting some gas out of the balloon. But there was no way for it to be steered. So the balloon had to be launched with the hopes that it would land in some place that was not under German Prussian control at that time. And most of them were. So this particular balloon headed northwest out of Paris and passed over the city of Soissons and was presumably viewed by the inhabitants of the city. And then it continued on and actually crossed the border and landed safely in Belgium. One reason that I like this card is because it tells us a lot about balloon mail. By showing the gondola of the balloon, it really tells us a story. So pictured here, there are 4 people in the balloon, which that was the maximum. Some carried fewer people. And attached on the outside, on the right-hand side, are bags of mail. And over here in the center is a rope and an anchor, which would be used to stabilize the balloon once it landed. And over here, there is, on the left-hand side, there's a cage full of pigeons. Those are homing pigeons. At that point, they were just used to send information back to Paris saying that the balloon landed successfully, and the mail would be then given to the French post office in areas outside Prussian control and then could be delivered. Later on, pigeons were used to actually get messages from the public into Paris, but that was not the case in October. So in 1955, the French celebrated the significance of this card. And as a related thing, the French started celebrating Stamp Day once a year. That's what it says on the left here, Journée du Timbre. That's Stamp Day. And the French Post Office, starting in 1944, issued a stamp every year to celebrate Stamp Day, and which had a philatelic theme. And in that year, the stamp, which you see pictured here, also celebrated the balloon mail. So it ties to the card and it ties to the cancel. One other thing I will point out, you see this gentleman waving what's probably a cloth in the air. He is not trying to signal the people below. What he's doing is trying to ascertain whether the balloon is ascending or descending. If the rate of change of altitude is slow, the passengers may not be able to notice it, but they certainly want to know if the balloon, especially if it happens to be descending and could then get too close to the ground inadvertently. So by holding that cloth up in the air, then they can see if by the movement of the cloth whether it is rising or falling. This is another card from a philatelic exposition. It pictures a rather striking statue. It is the female symbol of the Republic of France. in a very militaristic mode, leading a group of volunteers. The statue is titled The Departure of the Volunteers of 1792, which was the height of the French Revolution. I'll show you the complete sculpture in the next slide. That sculpture was created in 1836 and is shown on the Arc de Triomphe. The stamp itself on the postcard is not related by subject, but it is undoubtedly not a coincidence that its color matches the color for the card. Or actually, I suspect the card's color was chosen to match the stamp. So here is a picture of the whole statue, which you can see these volunteers placed underneath the symbolic woman there leading them on to battle for the Republic. And here's a picture of the Arc de Triomphe with the statue here on the right-hand side. These are not my pictures. These are just pictures that I stole off the internet. All right, now I'm going to talk about a few cards that have interesting markings on the back. So bear with me while I explain this. So this is a government postcard with a privately printed pictorial back, which I will talk about in a minute. But what you see on the card on the address side is that the postage to send the card was not sufficient. The card is, or the stamp image on the card is 1/2 penny. That's written in letters on the stamp, but you can't see it because of the Canterbury cancel. So a 1/2 penny at that time was the cost to mail a postcard within Great Britain. This card, however, was sent to the United States, and therefore it should have had 1 penny postage. And so this card was short a 1/2 penny. So the post office in Canterbury marked it with a T. That was a universal marking, the letter T, which stands for the French word tax, T-A-X-E, since French was kind of the common language for the Universal Postal Union, which set rules for international mail. And by the capital T, it says, hey, this card is short of postage. And over here on the left is the numeral 5. So what that means is 5 French centimes, and that is equal to 1/2 of a British penny. So in marking the amount that needed to be paid, the local currency was converted into French currency. Centimes are 1/100th of a franc, so that's essentially 5 cents in French currency, and 1/2 of a British penny was equivalent to 5 centimes. So with those two markings, the card was then sent off to the United States, and it was arrived at the post office in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. And they marked it with this hand stamp, collect postage 2 cents, because 5 French centimes is equivalent to 1 penny. But the recipient of the card was supposed to pay double the amount that the postage was short. This is a penalty to discourage people from short posting. And so the American recipient should have had to pay 10 centimes, which is equal to 2 cents. So that explains most of the markings. You see a double cancel here from Ocean Grove, which indicates when it was received on July 8th, 1899. And this oval cancel with a numeral 1, I believe that's a British cancel, but I honestly don't know what its significance is on this card. Now, typically, if the recipient paid the postage, the post office would add to this card what we call a postage due stamp, which is kind of a receipt for the postage. And we'll see an example of a postage due stamp on my next card. So this one doesn't have any indication whether that 2 cents was paid. So it might have been delivered and the 2 cents for some reason wasn't collected. The 2 cents might have been paid, but the post office didn't mark it. Or the recipient might have refused the card and the card just languished somewhere until some 120 years later it wound up in my collection. On the back of the card, or what we would consider the back, as this was a government printed card, some private company purchased that card from the government and then printed that picture and design and space for message, showing the gateway into Hampton Court, which was one of the historic residences of the British monarchy. So here's another one, postage due, this one from Switzerland sent to France. So there's the T again, it's a different format. But again, it signifies that there is some postage due. This stamp on the postcard was 5 Swiss centimes, which is not exactly equivalent to French centimes, but close enough for postage purposes. So Swiss have had and still have francs, and the French at that time had francs, but the two were not equivalent in rates, but they were close. So the T indicates that it was short paid. Over here in blue is the number 10. This is actually a 1, not a 2, because in Europe they tend to write a 1 with the serif at the top. So this card was mailed for 5 centimes. It should have been 10 centimes. So it was short paid 5 centimes. And by this time, the rule had changed. So the sending post office now put twice the deficiency on there. So the recipient in France owed 10 centimes. And here you see this postage due stamp, which is different than a postage stamp. It cannot be used to mail a letter. It can only be used to receive payment for postage due. And it was applied here. So the recipient presumably went to the post office and certainly paid the 10 centimes and picked up the card. The card itself shows a picture of the Swiss town of Lausanne. My third and final postage due stamp goes back to Great Britain. This is a card that was mailed within Great Britain, not internationally. It has a halfpenny stamp, which, as I said before, at this time was the cost for mailing a postcard within Great Britain. However, this card is an exception. It is not a normal postcard. It is a glitter card. There are some of the flowers have glitter on them, which I show in this picture down below. And the rules for British postcards at that time said, if this is an enhanced postcard in some way, it is not allowed to have the postcard rate. It needs to have the letter rate. So we see here the hand stamp in the center, it says liable to letter rate. And at the top, it says contrary to regulations. And there's the postmark here of the sending post office and 1 penny, which was twice the amount. The card should have been sent with 1 penny. It was sent with a half. That you double that, and that's 1 penny due by the recipient. It was received in the town of Liskyard, but again, as with the first card, we don't know if the 1 penny was paid or not. Here's a different story. This is a more recent card from 1956. And this is a card that is sent from a business in Paris to attract Americans who happen to visit Paris and encourage Americans to visit Paris. So it is the Parisian office of American Express, and it is soliciting business from the United States. And here, let me enlarge the card so you can see it while I read it. The message says, here at 11 Rue Scribe, the best known travel address in the world. Not anything subtle about this one. American Express has completed a cellar-to-roof interior remodeling just in time to handle the record volume of travelers predicted for 1956. Entertainment, fine food, historic attractions, beautiful scenery, art treasures. These are a few of the reasons why Paris is such a fascinating city to visit. Our entire staff looks forward to welcoming any of the staff of your bank or your customers who will be visiting Paris this year. And as you can see, it was sent to the vice president of a bank in Texas. And I have found, I was looking for and found a number of examples of Parisian or French companies actually sending mail to US customers or potential customers, encouraging them to visit Paris and come and participate and buy something from their business. And this is from days when it was still pretty much a ship voyage to get from the United States to Paris. And I was surprised that there was this much publicity. And obviously it was worthwhile for a French businessman to do that. This is a bit of an interesting card, similar in that it has to do with both France and US, but not an advertising card. So you see here, it's a picture of the Statue of Liberty, obviously in the United States. And it is franked with a stamp, a French stamp, picturing Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who of course was the designer. And you see on the message side, which was pre-printed or pre-typed probably, this card was bought at the Statue of Liberty on Liberty Island in New York Harbor. It was then sent to France for mailing in order to get the stamp issued by France honoring Bartholdi, and then sent back to America. That's what was written on here, but this card did not go to America. It went to someone in France. So the question is, who sent this card, what group, what organization, and what was the purpose? I have no idea. It's not an advertising card. It might have been some postcard group. It might have been a stamp collecting group. It might have been just a group of people who were from France and living in the United States. I have no idea. And this presumably perhaps went to someone who was involved in the mailing of this card. Most of them went back to America, but this card was kept in France as perhaps a souvenir to someone who's involved or a friend of that person. I don't know, but I think it's just an interesting card to have as an American card franked with a French stamp. And the card obviously went to France, and most of them would have gone back to the United States. This is a card with a very interesting story that I enjoyed finding out. In 1937, the French post office issued 2 stamps, one of which is pictured here, showing this Greek statue, which is called the Winged Victory of Samothrace. And I'll explain that in a minute. The 2 stamps, this red one at 55 centimes and a green one at 30 centimes, those were for the domestic postcard rates. For a long time, France had 2 different rates. One rate, the cheaper rate, was for a postcard that had 5 words or less, not counting the address and the date. And the more expensive one was for a postcard that had more than 5 words. Here we see the addresses on the left. The message on the right had 2 words. The signature is also excluded from that 5-card limit. However, the sender used the 55 centime stamp rather than the 30 centime stamp that would have paid for this. I suspect that the sender sent both of those to whoever the recipient was, and just chose to use the 55-cent stamp as an overpayment of postage. The way that the government raised money was the fact that you had to buy one postcard for each of the stamps that you bought. And the postcard sold for 70 centimes. So you could go to this museum or two other museums where the stamps were on sale. And if you bought a stamp, you had to buy a postcard with it. And so the money from the postcards was used for the museums, funds given to the museums. Now about that statue, this is an original Greek statue. It was on the island of Samothrace, which is an island in the Aegean Sea. It was an island where seamen would go to undergo some secret initiation rites. And in fact, it was so secret that even today we don't know what those rites were, but it was something that seamen did. And on the island was this statue of Victory, the goddess of victory, whose name was Nike, which was pronounced Nike at the time and somehow translated to Nike today. And the statue was in an area where it could be seen from a lot of the island. It is a big statue. It is more than 10 feet tall from her foot to the top of the wings. Her head and arms were never found. And I think wisely, the Louvre decided not to try to recreate them and imagine what they were, but instead leaves the statue pretty much as it was found. It has been repaired a little bit. It is located at a landing in one of the major staircases in the Louvre, and it is a very impressive statue. I should say that any postcard picturing any piece of art from the Louvre could be used. It did not have to be a Samothrace postcard, but this one is, and I think that makes this a special card because it's tied in with the postage stamp. This is one of a number of similar cards, which has to do with what is called the language of stamps, or specifically translating what's written here, stamps and their language. So this seemed to be a very popular thing around the beginning of the 20th century. And it kind of indicated that if you put the stamp on a card or a letter that you were sending to someone, the placement of the stamp indicated a message. And this is kind of the translation. So I'll translate some of this. Up here at the upper left is, I'm thinking of you, waiting for a letter, gentle kisses, I love you, until tomorrow, that kind of thing. There were not always good ones. Down here is adieu, which is the French goodbye, signifying goodbye forever. The more common au revoir in French means goodbye, see you later, or just a normal goodbye. But adieu is only used for someone you expect to never see again. And over here, this one says, forget me, oubliez-moi. So it could be used to give a negative message as well as a popular one. There are very many versions of this card, all of which have different positions of the stamps and have different translations. So if you were going to actually use it, you and your correspondent would have to agree upon it first. And then were you really then going to send the card with the message adieu on it to someone I don't know. But there are, as I said, a large number of these postcards dating from the beginning of the 20th century. This is just a card that I kind of liked from the Paris World's Fair of 1900. That was a big deal in Paris. And it shows the buildings from a number of countries who were represented there. Norway at the upper left, Bulgaria below that, Finland is featured in the center, and Serbia on the right. And it has, as a normal stamp, sent in 1900. This one dates back a little further, from the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, the World's Fair for which the Eiffel Tower was built as the entrance gate. Quite an impressive entrance gate, don't you think? And there is so this is what was a picture postcard at the time, an engraving of the Eiffel Tower. And on the front, you see the postage stamp, and you see a cachet here, a hand stamp, which says the summit of the Eiffel Tower. So there was, at the time, a post office there, and you could buy stamps and probably the picture postcard there as well, and get that cancel indicating that you had been at the top of the Eiffel Tower. And you probably know that today we can ride an elevator to the top, but the elevators had not been installed in 1899. So anybody who reached there climbed the stairs to get to the top of the Eiffel Tower. This is an interesting card that ties together philately and postcards. It is a German card which pictures a French postal service. The postman on the right and the residents on the left are all on stilts. I will get to the translation of this German in a minute. I want to point out that this is not an actual postage stamp. You can kind of see by the fact that the cancels do not extend onto the stamp. This is just a printed image of a stamp that would have been used, although it's the wrong color for a French stamp, or for the French stamp of 25 centimes at that time. So here's the translation. An interesting example of how the post office has to adapt to the peculiarities of a region is provided by the postman service in the provinces of the country and in the southern part of the Gironde, which is a region in southwestern France. Deep sand with high heather in between make it difficult to walk, and so the postman, like the residents of the area, uses échasses, high stilts, in order to be able to deliver the letters to the farmers and shepherds more quickly. Now, the only thing I'm curious about is why they didn't picture the postman walking through sand or grasses and so on. It looks like he's in an open field, and there's no reason for him to be on stilts, much less the recipients of the mail. Someone can only assume that they have left their sand dune region and gone to a clear area. Now, this is a very interesting item. This looks like a beer coaster, or what the British and the Irish call a beer mat. And indeed, that's what it is. It is a coaster, but it is also a postcard. This was distributed by Guinness in the Christmas season of 2019 in certain pubs in Ireland, and it was given out free to people who purchased a pint of Guinness. The printed stamp on here, however, it was valid for postage, and it was valid for international postage, so it could be sent either within Ireland or to any other country. It was given out there, and some of the pubs even had post boxes installed inside the pub for these cards, and if that was not the case, you could mail the card at a regular mailbox. Also, there's a note on the bottom of the card that Guinness was donating to a charity called Alone, which supported elderly people who were living alone at Christmas time. And finally, the ultimate collection, or the ultimate connection between postcards and philately, is postage stamps picture postcards. These were issued by the Pitcairn Islands earlier in 2023, and it pictures, there are 6 stamps with images of 6 picture postcards that date back to 1916. And here's one of the original pictures that the creator used. The creator's name, let me go back here. Henry George Keyes, who was a barber obviously an enterprising person who created these postcards from pictures from a ship in 1916. So I don't know if these are the only stamps picturing picture postcards, although I've never seen any other ones. But there's finally a pairing of postcards and philately. And so with that, I thank you very much for again allowing me to present, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, I will be glad to try to answer them.
Oh, that was great, Larry. Thank you so much. I enjoyed that very much. The one thing I was going to mention, I don't know, you know, being involved more in stamp collecting, I think, than in postcards. Are you familiar with our own Postcard History magazine, which is local?
No, I can't say that I am.
Oh,
No,
okay, that might be of interest to you because that goes into the history of postcards. I just thought I'd mention that. But any questions, please go ahead, Clarissa.
You mentioned that the postage was different or cost differently, whether you have 5 words or more. And in one of the cases, I found some postcard where the recipient had graded out the stamp because underneath the stamps, they had written more words. So there was a second message under the stamp for beating the limit on the number of words.
wow,
And
that is great. I did not know that.
and it was funny because I couldn't understand why they hide it, because it was the messaging seems that's personal or secret, but somebody else explained to me, yeah, that's one way to eliminate.
Interesting.
That is really great. I've noted that down, and we'll keep an eye out in case I run across one. It would be fascinating to have.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. I'm fascinated with that explanation, well, that postcard with the explanations for the placement of the stamps on the front of a French postcard and their secret meaning, because I see a lot of French postcards that have the stamp on the picture side.
Yeah.
So how prevalent was that amongst the French to pick a corner or a place on the card to give like a secret message?
I don't honestly know. I don't think those picture postcards, and I have a number of them with the stamp on the front, I don't think those were intended to send a message for the most part. If not all, I think they were just stamped, haphazardly by the sender. I could be wrong. I am told by my experienced collectors that there are envelopes or cards that maybe by looking at the message on them know that it was a language card. But since there are so many, I have, I don't know, a half dozen of the original cards from early 20th century. And then the French Post Office did some reprints more recently with other ones. So as I mentioned, the two people corresponding would have had to agree on this language. It wasn't a universal thing.
Yeah.
So that kind of tells me that it probably wasn't super
I like to think they did. I like to think that's the reason the French put their stamps on the front of the card, even when there's a stamp box on the back of the card.
Yeah.
Dan, there
Yes,
I have seen the same exact idea in English, in cards where it's showing the secret language of stamps based on the positioning. So it wasn't just French. I mean, whether or not people actually followed it, I have come across those postcards in English.
No, I think,
but I've never,
yeah, I
I've
think
not
that was,
noticed.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I know that in your presentation, I think you showed us a card like that, and I
did.
remember that when you were
Exactly.
showing. Don has unmuted himself and has been asked to. Please go ahead, Don.
Now that 1890, Exposition Universelle in Paris, I understood those cards were the first cards that showed a picture on them. And do you know anything about that? That that was the first time that pictures were on postcards. Did you ever hear?
Well, I don't think it was at first I thought it is not the world's first, but it may be the French first.
I have one of those. The other thing I wanted to mention, in 1954, I went to the American Express in Paris, and that's where people gave that address when they were tourists and wanted to pick up mail. And there was always a big crowd of people picking up their mail at that particular American Express office.
Well, let me explain that crowd on the picture postcard that I showed, which had the large number of people that are outside the office there.
Yeah.
I didn't know that it acted as kind of a general delivery.
Yes, it was.
It's very interesting
place. And lastly, I wanted to mention to people that these old postal cards from the late 19th century without pictures are very interesting philately, or what you know, on postcards. So I have a good collection of 1870 on forward of these kinds of postcards with often with a pre-printed stamp on them. And there's no pictures on them, but they're interesting cards, and you showed a number of those.
Yeah, I believe when postcards were introduced, which was around 1870, I believe that picture postcards were not allowed yet. And it was only sometime later, and I don't know when it was, when privately printed picture postcards were allowed that you could add a stamp to, as opposed to the pre-printed cards, which are the first ones that were introduced.
If you want, I can share the secret message under the stamps.
Oh,
To see
yeah.
what.
Go ahead.
Please.
Here it is. So this is two lovers in World War I. They were exchanging postcards. He wrote to her, and then he wrote something under. Sometimes it's not even really readable.
That's amazing.
So she removed the stamp, and in some cases she was not able to remove completely the stamp. This time it was sent.
That's the risk, I guess, right?
Yes, and that's one. This one it was sent to him from her. So, and then there's another one. This is sent to him from her. I'm fine. I will send you some letter tomorrow.
That's pretty neat. There's always cheaters somewhere, aren't there?
Larissa, are those in your personal collection?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Wow.
Yeah, those are part of a set of 500 postcards on two lovers that wrote to each other in World War I.
Okay.
And I'm reconstructing their story, and I found quite a bit about her. Thank you to one of the Canadian friends. And I'm trying to get some more, but I can't find anything about him after the war.
That's great.
Very interesting.
There is
Linda,
a talk about it on YouTube, Wichita Postcard Club.
Yeah. Lynn, did you have a question?
I just wanted to tell Larry that was such an interesting collection of variety of cards. Thank you for making neat comments about each one. And they were wonderful variety. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad.
Then I've got a number of old cards with printed pictures of stamps on the front of them from countries all over the world. Would that be an interesting subject for the newsletter?
Yeah, sure. What?
Yeah, I have a couple of those, and I've seen other ones. And that was also the beginning of the early 20th century when those were popular.
Thank you. I have a postcard. It's an American postcard, not a French postcard, but the sender actually wrote on the front of the postcard, look under the stamp.
Oh,
And
Oh,
I have not brought myself to soaking the postcard to remove the stamp to see what's under it. I suppose I'm waiting for the right time. Or I'm hoping that there's some X-ray machine or something that can tell me what's underneath it without having to remove the stamp, because I don't want to quote unquote deface the postcard. I want to keep it in its original condition if possible. But having said that, sooner or later, I do want to see what's written underneath the stamp.
So apparently the receiver of that postcard did not remove the stamp to see the message.
That's
You
what I
are
was thinking
correct.
too.
Was it lost? Maybe the postcard was lost and never reached the
Well, or
intended recipients.
the recipient just didn't do it for some reason, and now here we are, almost 100 years later. I have the card, and it's up to me to take the
Yeah.
plunge.
Lucky for me, the postcard that I show you, the recipient did it. I did not do it.
Right. You
Mhm.
didn't have to have that
No, I
responsibility.
didn't have it. That's how I discovered there was message under the stamp.
I'm going to see if I can find that card now.
in
That's
the old
great.
days, I used to get postcards where the stamp had been cut out of the postcard.
Oh, yeah.
And one of them shows the 5 Dion quintuplets. And by cutting out that stamp, they cut out one of the 5 quintuplets. That's terrible.
It's terrible.
This is because there were philatelic that like the stamps more than the rest of the postcard.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
Because I remember my father, he was always receiving stamp, completely soaking, taking out of the envelopes to put it in the album neatly.
Yeah. Huh. That's funny.
go ahead,
Larry,
Lynn.
I'll just say, Larry, I enjoyed your presentation so much. I learned so much from every card, but I was just fascinated by the balloon mailing, the balloon. That whole story was amazing, and the detail that you knew and relayed about how to navigate those things and what each thing was hanging off the balloon. It was just blew my mind. So, but thank you for all your research and information. And I've dipped my toe a little bit into philately and postcards, and now I'm afraid I'm going to have to go deeper. And I like stamps a lot too. But thank you so much. It was so interesting.
Well, I think if you were hanging a towel out of a balloon that was rising or falling, I don't see how that would affect what the towel or the rag looked like. You think it would go up when the balloon went down? I can't imagine that.
Well, no, the movement of the air, if the balloon were falling, I think the cloth would tilt upwards as the air rose or as the balloon fell in the air relatively.
I would like somebody to try that the next time they take a balloon ride and see if that actually happens.
Well, I didn't, I mean, I learned about it because I read about that when I was researching the balloon mail. And I was told that's what they did. Now,
I think the wind would
it might have been a
have
thin
more of an
cloth or
effect.
maybe a thin paper.
Would the wind have more of an effect than whether or not it was going up or down?
It might, if there were strong crosswinds, then probably yes. But if the air was relatively still, then I think that could have worked. Well, it was something because they didn't have any other way, no altimeters or anything like that at the time.
Somebody should try it out on the next balloon ride.
I have some advice from Mark. White vinegar will dissolve a lot of glues, and without necessarily having to soak the entire card. Or you can try acetone or mineral spirits, because acetone especially will evaporate very quickly, so might not affect the paper. Because the stamp is thinner, it might just go through the stamp and loosen the glue.
But will it erase the writing underneath if it's ink?
Yeah, that's what I would worry about. The acetone might dissolve
the ink, and which means then he won't see the message.
Well, from my days, even as a child, as a stamp collector, you could simply soak a piece of paper with a stamp on it in water, in warm water. The stamp would come off, and then eventually the paper itself would dry.
Yeah, but the water might dissolve the ink underneath. I think the way to get the message, like I saw on my postcard, was to grate to scrape a little bit the stamps and try to unglue it like this.
Well,
Yeah.
I like to think it's not a message, it's microfilm.
You might
we-
try steaming it. Maybe that's less.
Oh, that's true.
You might be able
Um,
to write. You might be able to write a book on this, Mark. You
Well,
know,
maybe it's
possible.
maybe it's a spy message from the Franco-Prussian War. We'll
There
find
you
out.
go. You never know.
Didn't people try to put messages into their mail so it wouldn't be edited by whomever, the
The
Yes.
censors.
But this one is
That's it.
bizarre because he write on the front, see the message under
Right.
the
I
stamp.
know, that's what I
So
thought
how
was so
secret can
weird.
it be? I mean,
Yeah.
anybody who get the card could get the secret
Yeah.
message, right?
Yeah,
I
like-
mean, if you want a
yeah.
secret message, don't say that is a secret message. and
I
where it
know,
is.
that was my thought exactly.
So maybe there is no secret message underneath.
Well, it's interesting. I tell you, every time we have one of these meetings, I learn so much every time, and it's I just can't thank you enough, Larry, for your presentation tonight. It was great.